Hello, I sent a form out. It should be in the description. If it's not, send me an email. But today we're going to talk about ethics in engineering, or more accurately, ethics in R&D. Engineering Code of Ethics states engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in areas of their competence, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. All right. So why are we talking about R&D? Well, that's a pretty common path for engineers to go, so we do need to talk about it to a certain extent. A lot of what engineers do, especially in the US, is using cutting edge technology, so things that have just recently been researched, just recently been developed, and that often leads to you doing some of the research and development yourself. So that means you're going to be creating new products, systems, or processes, as well as the improvement of existing ones. However, as engineers, we must remember that our work does not exist in a vacuum. The decisions we make in R&D processes can have significant impacts on society, the environment, and individuals. Therefore, it is crucial to consider ethics in engineering R&D. Ethical considerations can guide us in making decisions that not only lead to successful and innovative outcomes, but also respect the rights, safety, and well-being of stakeholders involved. Today, we'll explore ethical responsibilities of engineers in R&D, discussing some of the ethical issues that can arise, and learn from a case study or two. All right, ethical responsibilities in research and development. So you are still expected to be honest and have integrity. So in simple terms, this just means don't lie, but that also means you can't fabricate information. You can't say you ran a test when you didn't. You can't falsify information. You shouldn't mislead in any way. And lastly, you shouldn't plagiarize. If you didn't do the work, don't say that you did. I'll be honest with you, from personal experience and what I've seen other academics do, 9 times out of 10, just saying that somebody's done it and that their work is published is good enough. There's no expectation that you know and have done everything. In fact, it's usually looked positively on when you say, somebody else learned from their own set of mistakes, I'm just capitalizing on it. In addition to all that, you need to remember that you need to respect human rights. If there's a chance that your tests can affect other people, they need to be involved. That means you need to tell them why you're doing the test. You need to tell them what the test is going to do to them. And you're going to actually have to know. If you don't know at least the majority of the outcome of the test on a person, you shouldn't be doing it. So you need to get informed consent. You need to ensure privacy and confidentiality and minimize harm. Now, the thing is, especially when it comes to informed consent, the informed part is a big deal. Just because you said, oh, this might itch or this might hurt, that's not good enough. You need to tell them what's going to happen. And a handful of the cases that I'm going to go over, the doctor's version of informed versus the test subject's version of informed were very different. You also have to remember what you're doing needs to be safe. You have to have already done all of the risk mitigation before you do the test. Now, I want you to think about real-world applications. Nobody wants to pay for a test that doesn't collect information. And honestly, most people don't want to pay for any tests at all because the test in and of itself usually doesn't provide any financial benefit. So in a lot of industrial applications, when you go run a test, you should already know what's going to happen before you do it. And the same thing should happen when people are involved. Your coworkers, the public, yourself, you should already know 80 to 90% of what's going to happen when you run a test. And you should know the test will work. All the test is doing is validating certain portions of your assumptions, quantifying certain things you couldn't measure beforehand, but nothing should be a surprise. You want to make sure that what you're doing is sustainable. So sometimes the issue isn't so much how the R&D was done or why the R&D was done, or it's the fact that the R&D wasn't done. And a lot of times what that ends up leading to is environmental problems. If I dump this chemical out, is it going to stick around forever? Is it going to be a forever chemical? Well, if it's not going to be beneficial forever, you probably shouldn't. And as always, you need to be transparent and open about your communication. 9 times out of 10, if you're honest with people, transparent with them, and you yourself are being honest and commendable, people will let you do what you want to do. So you should just be doing that to begin with. All right. These are the most common R&D ethical problems, especially in engineering. The first is conflict of interest. Why are you doing the study? Why are you doing the test? Are you doing the test for the pursuit of knowledge because you have an end goal? Or are you trying to make money? Now, I need to be clear. Making money is perfectly fine as long as everything else you're doing is ethical. But the problem is when that pursuit of money starts trumping your ethics. You stop worrying about how this will affect other people. You stop worrying about the long-term goals. You stop worrying about the pursuit of knowledge. As soon as that stuff gets thrown away, all right, financial interests become really important. If there's any level of data manipulation, so a lot of times this comes in the form of misrepresentation, lying about the tests you ran. And the thing is, when you do studies, especially public studies, and you share your results, people will take what you have as valid and honest and worth looking at, and they themselves will try to build on top of it. And if the foundation you're providing to others is garbage, what they build is going to fall down, and they're not going to be happy about it. And a lot of times what ends up happening is they go after you. And that's not something you want to deal with. Then there's intellectual property rights. This is, I don't want to say debatable, but it is subjective. People have different opinions on it. And unfortunately, this one does become a legal issue. If you are using somebody's idea without their permission, especially if that idea can hurt people, they might take action on it. They might make your life difficult for doing that. A lot of times, all it requires is a discussion with them of, I'm trying to do this test. Can I use your technology? And a lot of times they'll let you use it for free. But if you don't even have that conversation with them, and they don't know you, and they think you're doing something nefarious, they don't want their invention and their name associated with you. And again, they can make your life really hard. So we need to talk about conflicts of interests. So if any one of these ever happens and you get caught, it can ruin your career. And these are reasons you don't want to have conflicts of interest. So when I worked for the Navy, and to a certain extent even now, I have to announce my investments. especially when I'm giving direction to people about how they should spend their money. And the reason for this is there have been instances where people would direct other companies on how they should invest their money. And it turned out that the reason wasn't because that investment was what was best for the company. It was that investment caused another investment's value to go up, causing the person giving the advice to have a big gain. If that happens once and you're caught, no one's going to want to work with you again. And it really compromises all of your past work and all of your future work, especially if some of the people you're working with can't forget. It erodes trust between you and your employer, customer, and the public. Stuff like that follows you. You can't just quit the company so that way your employers and customers don't know anymore. Everybody's going to know your name. If you have a conflict of interest, it will generate a bias. And it might lead you to start looking for results that aren't really there. So before you run a test and before you announce results, you really want to disclose possible conflicts of interest. It might not really be a conflict of interest. I have investments that the Navy did ask me a ton of questions about before I gave my recommendations on how they should spend $1 billion. But once we talked about it and I showed them my net worth and what I had invested in, they said, you know what? This decision, not really, we're not worried about your conflict of interest. And they moved on. Now, most institutions have policies in place to manage stuff like this, which is good. But if that company or institution doesn't have a policy, you should still announce it ahead of time. So these are examples of conflict of interest. So engineering contracted to assess structural failure, worked for a company that built the structure that failed. This actually happened. So the company that designed the bridge, their lead engineer eventually got hired by the government. And what ended up happening was when the dam failed, the lead engineer who was supposed to figure out why it failed had actually been the guy who designed it. And so even though all of the results pointed to bad design because he was the guy who was reviewing it, he made every other excuse saying, not my fault. Another case of conflict of interest is reviewing and approving engineering offer redesign services. So unfortunately, this is a case where it doesn't even need to actually be the case. It just needs to look like the case. So if it looks like an engineer is awarding themselves a contract on behalf of either the government or a company or a family member or something like that, it can look like you're only awarding it to yourself because you have financial gain by winning the contract. And the last is engineers awarding contracts to friends. So BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, was awarded a contract, but the engineer who reviewed the proposals had actually worked for one of the companies proposing. There's data manipulation. So you really don't, again, if you get caught at doing any of these, this stuff follows you. As much as I'd love to say people forget, that's not really the case. It violates trust. Again, the people around you aren't going to want to work with you. If people look at your results and try to build on top of it, you've given them a poor foundation. They're going to notice. They're going to get upset. If this next part is frustrating because a lot of times, we as engineers get affected by this, even though we've done everything right. If a doctor, some kind of scientist, another engineer does something shady, even though we have nothing to do with them, and what they did was egregious and very rare, because we have an association with them, the general public will assume that we were with them when they did it and part of the problem. And again, this stuff follows you. It destroys your reputation and it follows you, and it will make it really hard for you to get work. So these are the types of data manipulation. There's data fabrication, so that's just making stuff up. There's data falsification, so you'll take a official looking document and fill it in with false information. Selective reporting, so if you've got 10,000 reports saying apples are fruit and one report saying it's a vegetable, and only acknowledging the one report about vegetables, that's selective reporting. There's plagiarism. This is when you say you did something when it was really somebody else. This could also be instances where you say somebody else does something when they didn't. The last is adding too many authors. Sometimes this is just like a ghost author. There was one instance where a physicist had to put a second author on his journal article, so he ended up putting his cat on there. Or not giving credit when somebody did work on it. That's why when you see journal articles, there might be like 5 different people working on it. This is why. They don't want to forget to add somebody. There's intellectual property rights. So this one's a bit subjective. Not everybody agrees on this, or at least agrees on how holy IP is. But being that I own some IP and I have a patent, I do have some opinions on it. So the first is, if the patent I used got used incorrectly and somebody got hurt, I'd be upset, especially if they came to me and said, "Why did you design this?" One of the first things I would say that would come out of my mouth is, "Why were you using it that way?" Right? So you want to at least have, if it's not a very commonly used patent, you at least want to have that conversation with the person who designed it and say, "What's up? Let's talk about this." If you're doing it, especially for R&D, a lot of times they will give you all of the information they have, as long as you make it clear, "I'm trying to do R&D." This also, stealing property IP does harm innovation in a sense. It drives certain people to not want to have patents. And really, from an innovation standpoint, you want people to be continuously improving all of the time. So you want them to have patents. You want people to have good ideas and share them. Depending on the manner in which you steal the patent, there could be some serious legal consequences. One example would be, so for my patent, there's an actual fee associated with it. If you want to use it, there's a fee to use it. Now, the fee is nominal. It's more of a, "Hey, I want my name on whatever you do with it," kind of thing. But let's say you become a millionaire because you make one tiny little modification to that patent, but you don't attribute anything to the original patent. I could hypothetically sue and say, "No, you stole from me. That was my idea." And sue you for it. And I might get all the money that you made. Um, Depending on the scenario, the manner in which it's done, it can also really damage your professional reputation. It's one thing if it's an accident, a lot of people will shrug it off, but if it's intentional violations, it's a totally different conversation. All right, so we're going to go into our first scenario. This should be the first section of um, the form. So, a leading surgeon has developed a revolutionary method for performing complex organ transplants. The procedure has already saved several lives in critical cases where no other treatment would have worked. One afternoon, you learn that a close family member, so like mom, dad, sibling, has suddenly fallen ill and urgently needs the same transplant to survive. The only specialist capable of performing it is this surgeon. The operation is scheduled within days. As you prepare for the procedure, you begin to review the surgeon's published work. You disclose that the surgical techniques was refined years ago through a series of highly controversial studies. In these studies, the doctor experimented on individuals who were already near death. Participants had not given consent and their suffering had been disregarded. When questioned later, the surgeon defended his actions, stating that his work had advanced medicine for the greater good and that the subjects were already beyond saving. All right, this is as much information as I can give you online. Please finish the section of the form associated with it before proceeding. I'm going to pause here for about for about 3 seconds, and then move to the next slide. 1, 2, 3. All right, so there is one personal ethical decision you need to make. Do you proceed with the procedure? You know that the information on how to do this procedure was collected by that surgeon. You know what he did was unethical to go get it, but you know it works. So do you approve the surgery? Do you refuse the surgery? Or do you seek some kind of other alternative? All right, before I proceed, answer this question. I know this is one of the form questions. All right. So, why do I bring this up? Well, during World War II, after World War II, the Allies started finding that at a lot of the concentration camps, there had been medical tests. None of the test subjects volunteered, approved of, or wanted these tests to be done on them. Some of the tests were for hypothermia, some of them were for surgery, some of them were for aviation medicine. A lot of the people looking out into the situation described it more like extreme torture without any real outcomes. Most of the findings were rejected. They had actual flaws in the procedural setups. They were inconsistent, but most importantly, the way they obtained the information was inhumane. However, some of the discoveries did end up getting used. Specifically, things around surgery and sterilization before surgery. So the question you need to ask yourself is, can knowledge gained unethically ever be ethically used? So, some modern surgical and medical techniques were later refined from knowledge areas first exploited unethically, including organ transplants, hypothermia treatment, pressure and altitude medicine. Today's procedures do not necessarily depend on those experiments, but the results of those experiments were used for a period of time before better techniques were developed. Yeah. So because of that testing that's when they started introducing the concept of doing research, specifically medical research, in an ethical way. Now, I don't want to mislead you or make this sound better than it is, but the Nazis were not the first group of people to conduct medical tests unethically. It had been going on for a very long period of time, so it wasn't really a new thing to go do. If you look into the history of rabies and how they found a cure for rabies, a lot of the tests were on not consenting slaves. So this was just kind of the wake-up call that they need to define something to make it clear that medical tests need to be done in an ethical way. The big ones being it needs to be voluntary, and they need to know the outcomes of what's going to happen. The experiment must avoid unnecessary harm. That means that the person executing the test has to have already made all of the necessary actions to reduce risk. It must be conducted by a qualified scientist, meaning the person doing the testing actually needs to know what they're doing and needs to be responsible. And participants must be free to withdraw at any time. The code led directly to the modern oversight system, so institutional review boards. URI has an institutional review board, and global medical ethical standards. All right, next project or next case. So this one should be in your form as well. It's the 15th year of a 30-year public health study. The project's stated goal is to observe the natural progression of a chronic illness to better understand its long-term effects. You've been assigned to the research team as a new assistant. The study includes hundreds of participants, some of whom carry the illness and others who do not. Participants were recruited years ago under the impression that they were being treated for a general medical condition. In exchange for their involvement, they receive free checkups, basic health services, and small benefits such as meal stipends and insurance coverage. As you review past reports, you realize that the participants have never been informed of their actual diagnosis, and they have not been offered the available treatment for the condition, a treatment that has been proven safe, effective, and widely accessible for several years. Senior members of the research team are aware of both the participants' condition and the availability of the treatment, but have decided to continue to study unchanged, arguing that it provides a unique long-term data set. Before I proceed, finish this section of the form. All right, I want you to think about this. I want you to think about what you would do in that scenario. You've just been told that these people are sick, that there is a treatment, and they're just not getting the treatment to make it go away. And they also don't know that there's a treatment. What would you do next, and how would you justify it? I want you to think about it before I proceed. I'm going to proceed in 3 seconds. So 1, 2, 3. All right, so this was the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. So in 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began studying the effects of syphilis. So they went to a group of black men from the Tuskegee area who had syphilis. Now, at the time, it made sense to do this because they didn't have any information and there wasn't really a cure for syphilis at the time. The study involved 600 black men, 399 of them had syphilis, and 201 did not have the disease. The participants were not informed about the nature of the study. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term used to describe several ailments, including syphilis, but could also have been anemia and fatigue. So the big thing here is it's not informed consent. They're misleading the participants. The participants don't know that they have syphilis. They would have to have been explicit about it. All right, so penicillin gets invented in 1943, doesn't really become widely available until about the 50s. However, at no point in time are the participants told that what they have is curable by penicillin. In 1972, there's an AP story that about the study was published, leading to the end of the study. But one thing I want to point out here is the use of the study at this point kind of has died, right? It's been 15 years by 1950, right? With penicillin being widely available, being one of the first things doctor prescribes whenever you have any ailment, what's the point of going and proceeding with this study? What are they actually gaining from this at this point, other than saying that they don't want to admit to what they were doing to begin with? So when it comes to R&D, especially medical R&D, you need to give full consent, or you need to get full consent, which means you have to give full information. And in this case, saying the condition you have is now curable is one of the pieces of information you would have had to provide, which they didn't. So I want you to think about this. These are full-grown men. They're married. They're having kids. If they have syphilis, they're spreading syphilis. Sex is not the only way to get syphilis. And they're not just endangering the men in this study, they're endangering anybody who works with or has to deal with these men. And so the fact that they didn't end the study, that they didn't help the patients at all, just compounds how unethical this situation was. In this case, it wasn't really a dilemma. It was just gross incompetence. So when it got caught, when it became public what was going on, yeah, there was a class action lawsuit and the money paid out. But I want you to think about what's $10 million split 600 ways. That's $16,000, $17,000 in 1974. What is that worth today? And would you go get syphilis for that amount of money? Yeah, there was a public apology by the government, but would you say, okay, that $16,000 and that apology definitely justifies me having syphilis? And think about the people who were indirectly affected by this study who didn't get anything. All right. Negative reinforcement, improved memory. So if you've seen Ghostbusters, this is similar to the opening scene. So imagine you are a volunteer in a psychology study on memory and learning. Participants are divided into two groups. Your task is to help another person, the learner, remember pairs of words. Each time the learner gives a wrong answer, you're told to administer a small electric shock to help reinforce correct responses. The supervising research instructor or the supervising researcher instructs you to increase the intensity slightly after each wrong answer. As the test continues, the learner becomes belligerent and asks you to stop. The researcher calmly reminds you that it's a safe procedure and that you need to proceed. So, what do? So before you go to the next slide, I'm going to count to 3, but I want you to answer the remaining content in the form. 1, 2, 3. All right, so these are the general questions from the form. If you were part of a study where a researcher instructed you to apply increasing pressure or discomfort to another participant as part of the learning test, at what point would you stop? So there's no there's no wrong answer here, but I want you to spend time thinking about it. When you're following instructions from a supervising researcher or manager, does that remove your personal responsibility for what happens as a result? And lastly, if you were asked by a superior to continue a procedure that was causing visible discomfort or potential harm, but they assured you it was necessary and safe, how would you respond? Again, I want you to think about it. I'm going to count to 3 before I proceed. 1, 2, 3. All right, so this actually happened, and the results are, pun not intended, shocking. So the scenario is based on the Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment conducted from 1961 to 1963 at Yale University. Teachers thought they were giving real shocks to learners. The shocks were fake, and the learners were part of the experiment in the sense that they were paid actors. The experimenter was also an actor. He was dressed as an authority figure, instructed them to continue regardless of the learner's distress. So, the teacher in this scenario believes with all of their body and emotions that they're genuinely giving shocks to the learners. 65% of the people who participated brought the shocks up to 450 volts. Many of the participants, the teachers in these, showed very high levels of stress. They were sweating, shaking, even crying in some instances, but they still executed the requirement. Why this matters? So the shock level in the previous slide in the experiment would have killed the learner, okay? To the point that the learner was supposed to effectively play dead before the last shock and show all the signs of being unconscious and dead. And the instructor would walk right up to the teacher and say, you need to do it again. You need to go to the next highest level. You need to shock them to see their reaction. And 65% of the people who were participating did it. 100% of the people went to 300 volts, which was enough to kill somebody. So the chances that your boss can walk right up to you and say, you need to do this. That's all they need to say. You need to do this. Regardless of what it is, especially if it's murder, there's a 65% chance you will do it. The thing is, a lot of bosses do this not because they need you to do the thing. They do this so that way they can point blame at you. And the thing is, I can't say it will or won't be your fault, or that you won't be responsible. It's generally accepted that you own some of the responsibility here, even though you were just following directions. part. So we're going to discuss the Wakefield experiment. This is not part of the form. Wakefield experiment, if you're not familiar with it, Wakefield was a doctor. He was paid by a law firm to find a problem with MMR. Measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines. So the way he did it was he took 12 children aged between 3 and 10, and all the kids had a history of normal development followed by a loss of acquired skills, including language, together with diarrhea and abdominal pain. Parents of 8 out of the 12 children linked the onset of behavioral symptoms with the MMR vaccine. The children were admitted to the hospital for a series of diagnostic tests over a period of 5 to 10 days. The study was approved by the Ethical Practice Committee of the Royal Free Hospital NHS Trust, and parents gave informed consent. So I'm going to go over some of the findings or some of the methods here and why they're inherently unethical. So the first is he is paid to find results. If you are doing a genuine experiment, a genuine test for R&D, you do not find results. You don't find problems like this. You are manufacturing a problem at this point. You should already know. You should have substantive data pointing to something you already know to be true. In this case, that's not what was happening. 12 children. Yeah, just because they have parents, the children themselves need to also give consent. I have been part of a medical study. The doctor took me aside when my parents weren't around and said, I can't do this study without your permission. Same thing applies here. Do you think a 3-year-old is smart enough and aware enough to give that kind of consent? Number one. And number two, when it comes to statistics, 12 data points is not very good. Your results, more or less, can be explained by noise in the data with just 12. You need to have at least 30. But for medical studies, it should definitely be closer to 300. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this is the procedure. The children underwent a series of invasive procedures as part of the study. This included lumbar punctures and colonoscopies. Blood samples were taken from the children from immunological studies. The children's parents were asked to provide a detailed personal and family psychiatric history. The children's developmental regression was linked temporarily to the MMR vaccine by the parents or the child's physician. That is to say, around the same time that the child got the MMR vaccine is when the child's behavior changed. The study proposed a new syndrome of enterocolitis and regressive autism triggered by exposure to the MMR vaccine. All right, so there are some issues here. One of them is how the colonoscopy and lumbar puncture are associated with the MMR vaccine, and why that has anything to do with the overall study. Are the parents subject matter experts on psychiatry? There is an expectation that the subject matter experts in this be genuine subject matter experts. Yes, parents know their children the best, but are they psychiatrists? Are they the appropriate people to be doing a psychological study. The results. The study proposed the new syndrome. The study reported that 8 out of 12 children showed behavioral symptoms shortly after the MMR vaccine. It was reported that all 12 children had intestinal abnormalities ranging from lymphoid nodular hyplasia to aphthoid ulceration. The study claimed that 9 out of 12 children, 75%, had a form of autism that was new variant and associated with gastrointestinal symptoms. The study suggested a possible link between the MMR vaccine, a new form of autism, and gastrointestinal disease. Okay. So, the issues here aren't obvious as much, but when they say 8 out of 12 showed behavioral symptoms shortly after the MMR vaccine, they're omitting information, like what that behavioral symptom was. Specifically, the child was upset that mom and dad held them down while they got stabbed. Wakefield was not a doctor of psychology. He had no business diagnosing somebody with autism. So there are ethical issues here. So the big one is the sample size. It was only 12 people. You just want more. There was not proper consent. The study involved invasive procedures, which were not necessary for the children's clinical care. It was later revealed that Wakefield did not have the necessary ethical approval to conduct these procedures. Furthermore, it's unclear whether the parents of the children fully understood the nature and purpose of these procedures when they gave consent. There was a conflict of interest. Wakefield did not mention that he was being paid by a law firm to help them sue the manufacturer of the MMR vaccine. This is a significant conflict of interest. Additionally, Wakefield owns a patent, and at the time owned a patent on a competing version of the MMR vaccine. The study reported that the children developed autism symptoms shortly after receiving the MMR vaccine. However, it was later revealed that some of the children had shown these symptoms before the vaccine as well. This suggests that the data was deliberately falsified to support the study's conclusion. This led to unjustified public harm. The study suggested a link between MMR vaccines and autism based on a weak and flawed evidence. This caused widespread fear and confusion among parents, leading to a significant drop in vaccination rates and subsequent outbreaks of measles. As a doctor, Wakefield had a duty of care towards his patients. By conducting unnecessary and invasive procedures without proper ethical approval, by falsifying data, he breached this trust. All right, so this is not in one of the forms, but we're going to talk about the effects of power. It does affect you. You do need to understand this. So this is the experimental setup. They took 24 male students and they randomly assigned them to 2 positions. They were either prisoners or they were guards. The prisoners were sent to a mock-up of an actual prison, and the guards were given uniforms, batons, and mirrored sunglasses. The prisoners were arrested at their homes, so they weren't told they were prisoners at the time. They were just saying, oh, you're either going to be a prisoner or you're going to be a guard. And they hadn't been told which ones they were going to be. But they were charged with robbery and sentenced to prison. The effects of power. So the prisoners were subject to dehumanizing processes to mimic the process of entering a prison. So dehumanizing someone is inherently unethical, right? They were stripped, deloused, and given prison uniforms. This is not uncommon when somebody gets arrested. It's not uncommon to strip them naked and spray them down. The guards were given complete control over the prison with minimal interference from the researchers. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but was terminated after just 6 days due to the disturbing behavior. The guards began to display sadistic tendencies, and the prisoners showed signs of extreme stress and anxiety. Some prisoners were released early due to severe emotional distress. All right, so some background here. The experiment that caused this was not adequately set up. They didn't minimize the chance of harm like they were supposed to. One of the things that happened here is one of the prisoners effectively said, I don't want to be part of this experiment anymore. And they wouldn't let him go. Not only would they not let him go, but the guards would not communicate this piece of information to the head researcher, who was acting as the foreman. And even when he was provided this information, he didn't act immediately. Further, all of the prisoners wanted to leave, not just one, but one of them showed enough distress that they let him go. This one prisoner was only able to get the experiment canceled, not by going to the police, which he did. Police didn't care. He went to the researcher's girlfriend and said, "This is what your boyfriend's doing. You need to make him stop." And only after she threatened to report him to the review board did he stop the experiment. Now, Zimbardo, the researcher, he himself became too involved with the study. As the warden, superintendent, whatever you want to call him, he started having a conflict of interest. He was part of the study, and the truth is, a lot of times you need to be separated from the study when it's being executed. This is why they have double-blind studies for medical devices and pharmaceuticals. When he had gotten approval ahead of time, but as the experiment went out, the individual pieces of the experiment went in ways he wasn't expecting, which should have led to him stopping the experiment, and he just chose not to. This one is also not in the form. We're going to talk about the Demon Core. So this was manufactured during World War II as a fissile core for the atomic bombs. Fissile means that the metal degrades to lower atoms instead of higher atoms like a hydrogen bomb, which is a fusion reaction. It was involved in 2 fatal accidents at Los Alamos. This core was about 6.2 kilograms, and it was about 90 millimeters in diameter. It consisted of 3 components: a plutonium-gallium hemisphere, another plutonium-gallium hemisphere, and a ring. The ring was designed to keep neutron flux from jetting out of the joined surfaces between the 2 hemispheres during implosion. So the first incident, this is Dr. Harry Daghlian. He made a mistake while working on the reflector. He accidentally dropped a brick onto the core, causing the core to go into supercritical, a self-sustained critical chain reaction. Daghlian died 25 days later of acute radiation poisoning. That's his hand, shortly before he died. So this one could kind of be, you could do some hand waving saying they didn't realize how dangerous this was, which was a common issue, especially in the late 40s. They didn't realize how dangerous nuclear material was. But the thing is, the experiment he was trying to run could have been done a handful of other ways. He was just, well, for lack of a better way to describe it, being lazy. He knew that there was a risk, and it just led to this incident where he accidentally gave himself enough radiation to kill himself. However, there was a second incident about a year later. Louis Slotin and 7 other personnel were conducting an experiment to verify the closeness of the core to criticality by the position of the neutron reflector. Now, the way they did this was they would take a screwdriver, specifically a flathead, and they would adjust the space between the two hemispheres. Unfortunately, the core slipped, it entered supercriticality, and released an intense radiation burst. The people in the room described a light burst, literally a burst of light coming out of the core. The experiment was conducted manually. So just as a general statement, manual tests tend to have a high human risk factor to them. Human error is very common. This was another test that could have absolutely been avoided. So the aftermath of these incidents, they realized, okay, we actually have to take this seriously, which is frustrating for me to think about, because why did it have to happen twice? You can do the hand waving for the first time, not knowing the risk, but the second time is just gross incompetence. Eventually that core, because it had killed 2 people, was destroyed, but it's an inanimate object. It wasn't the cause of those deaths. It was the institution and the operators. All right, so now this is the last case. A new synthetic compound has shown unprecedented effectiveness against mosquitoes and agricultural pests. Just a few milligrams can protect an entire household for months. It's inexpensive to produce, stable under harsh conditions, and easy to transport to remote areas. Field tests show sharp reductions in malaria, typhus, and the plague. Military has already been using it successfully to protect troops from insect-borne diseases. Because of this compound, you've, for the most part, eradicated disease, and you've made feeding the world a lot easier. Agricultural agencies report that this compound reduced crop loss dramatically, protecting vital food supplies. The World Health Organization praises it for its life-saving potential in disease-endemic regions. It's long-lasting, reducing the need for repeated spraying and lowering labor costs, and communities using it report fewer infections, improved harvest, and strong economies. So I want you to answer the questions in the form here before you proceed. I'm going to count to 3 and then I'm going to proceed. 1, 2, 3. All right, so what we're actually talking about here is DDT, dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane. So it was developed in 1874, but it wasn't really used until World War II. It was very effective, it was cheap, it was long-lasting. It was stable and persistent. You only had to apply it about once a month. The problem here that people were not aware of is it stays in the soil. It has a half-life of 15 years. If you consume it, it stays in your fat. So even though your body doesn't process it right away, you might have to process it later, and that can get you sick. It has an ecological impact. It does cause larger animals that you don't want to die to get sick, specifically birds, fish, and amphibians. There's this idea of biomagnification. So even though you only spray what's equivalent to a kilogram over a large area, because the smaller animals eat it, and those smaller animals get eaten by bigger animals, and those bigger animals get eaten by even bigger animals, the biggest animal ends up eating many, many times more per pound than the other animals. So it gets a higher dose of DDT. And then there's a human factor here. Literally, we can get sick from it. If the if the concentration is high enough, we can get sick. Um, and because of this, it can cause serious symptoms to us. Um, and one of the big issues is breast cancer. It causes breast cancer. So there's an ethical issue here, um, and I want to tie it back to R&D, specifically that it was skipped. Um, Now, again, you can do some hand waving here, basically say, well, they invented it in 1874 and they just kind of forgot to do the safety testing. Um, but what really happened was there was a panic in the 30s of we can't feed everybody. And so with the onset of World War II, they had to come up with some solution. So they chose DDT and it worked. Um, And so the scientists and engineers involved became a bit myopic, meaning so focused on the problem in front of them, they kind of forgot the problems they were introducing. Um, and so you want to have ethical foresight. You don't want to be stuck in that situation where you're only looking in front of you. You're only looking at the problem right in front of you and ignoring all of your other problems. Um, so Other modern parallels are things like AI optimization. I've said it before and I say it again. You need to learn to use AI now, or you're going to fall behind competitively in the real world. But there are other problems with AI that need to be addressed. And if they don't get addressed, they're going to cause even bigger problems. There are issues like PFAS. These are permanent, they're not going anywhere. They've started to find that a whole percentage of animals by weight are PFAS. We don't know how to get rid of it. And this might cause long-term problems that we can't handle. And then there's gene editing. Um, this raises the issue of consent. We haven't gotten to that point, but when we start having kids who are gene edited, are they going to be able to have that argument? Or, or is that something we're going to have to deal with of, I didn't consent to this modification? So, like I said, for DDT, the urgency overrode the decision making process. Um, and you can also make the argument that you would rather die from cancer in 20 years than to die of hunger today, which is what a lot of people at the time had the option of. But at the same time, just because there was this urgency to get things approved and moved along doesn't mean they shouldn't have gone back and done the studies. And that applies today. Just because a decision has been made to do something today doesn't mean we shouldn't still look at the effects of doing it today. Just because government and industry is heavily invested in something doesn't mean it's good. This is common confusion that you need to make an effort now to avoid. This is another issue that people run into a lot. They just assume because they have early successes that they're not going to have failure and therefore shouldn't be scrutinized, which is not true. Everything you do that affects anybody else should be scrutinized. Um, Modern parallels again are software and AI. It had huge jumps 2 or 3 years ago. Since then, they've been making progressive improvements, but the pushback and the studies of how this affects people not really there, and they should be done. And from time to time, medical devices, procedures, and drugs get pushed through the approval process without having any of those questions asked. It's not as common, and it tends to be for different reasons. So an example would be COVID. COVID got pushed through the approval process. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't look back and look at the side effects of the COVID vaccine, or if there were any. So you want to make sure that what you're doing, even though it's solving a problem, isn't making new ones. Now, I don't want to make the use of DDT to be a villainy type statement. They were given, with the information they have, the time they had to make the decision, and their options. I don't necessarily think they made the wrong decision. However, after the urgency ended, specifically when World War II ended, that's when they should have gone back and said, all right, let's think about what we just did and see if it made sense. And the thing is, that happens all of the time, where you make a decision now, you have a Band-Aid solution to a problem, because you have to have a Band-Aid solution, but you do need to go back and fix it when you're done. And a lot of places, a lot of people, they don't view it that way. They view it as, even though it's only a Band-Aid, it's a solution, so you check the mark and you can keep going, which is absolutely not how you should behave. A lot of people try to make the argument that they're not responsible. And 9 times out of 10, I'm going to tell you, you're better off taking a small amount of responsibility and defining why that's your responsibility than you are saying you are not responsible. Just because it makes you sound partially guilty when you say, I'm not responsible for that. I had nothing to do with that. You also have to think about what the thing you're making, process, system, design, invention, whatever, discovery, you have to quantify why it's good for everybody. And make it clear that's why you were doing it. In the case of DDT, yeah, they made a handful of bad decisions, but we need to learn from those decisions moving forward. Trust me, you want to be the man or woman who learns from other people's mistakes. You don't want to have to repeat these mistakes. So when you're designing something, you actually want to design the full life cycle. You want to think about cars, not just the section about when you use the car, but the whole life of the car, the manufacturing cycle, the first owner cycle, the second owner cycle, the throwaway cycle. What does that whole thing look like? You have to be responsible for all of that. Just because you didn't manufacture the Tesla doesn't mean you aren't part of the problem by owning the Tesla. When you're working with people and you're doing experiments and tests, especially if it's on them, you need to be clear. You need to communicate what you're doing and why. They can't have any surprises throughout your test. And when what you're doing gets published, they can't say, I knew nothing about that. They need to be like, oh yeah, I knew exactly about that. And this is my reaction to what happened. You need to do all of the legwork ahead of time to make sure no one will experience harm during your tests or your experiments. You're going to own the responsibility of whatever you invent, whatever you design, whatever process you establish and validate. You are partially responsible, even if people decide to use the thing you invented wrong. Do you think the people who designed and built the first atomic bombs realized what they were doing and how it was going to lead to other people's lives? They thought they were doing something peaceful at first, and then it turned into a bomb. So you need to remember you are going to be responsible for the things you work on, even after it leaves your lab.